found he misused his position.
Be found guilty by an independent process and just have their mates vote them back into the job.
Missing WhatsApp messages were discovered.
Is that all guidance was followed?
This fictional party was a business meeting.
As we seemingly bounce from one scandal to the next, my MP Steve Tierney has been appointed with the task of sorting out the dysfunction in Downing Street. However, under the idiom of putting one's own house in order, shouldn't we be asking what of the dysfunction in his own constituency? My name's Dave Humphrey, and after spending several years fighting locally for simple justice, the contents of Freedom of Information Request 7574 came as no great surprise. You see, it revealed how in the last 5 years the Fenland District Council received 142 complaints against its officers and a further 33 made against elected politicians. And yet, with the exception of one, understood to have been entered by the council's own monitoring officer, how many of these complaints were upheld? None. That's 5 years worth of complaints, and it seems every single one dismissed out of hand. Hence the title of this report. So, how did they achieve such a perfect record? It's not like local government isn't without its own scandals. For example, we've had our own expenses scandal, with a councillor repeatedly entering exaggerated mileage claims over several years. My personal campaign, which uncovered the misuse of almost £1 million of funding by an organisation whose board was largely consisted of prominent local politicians. And as reported in the Private Eye magazine, we even have our own Partygate, of which one alleged offender, by comparing them to dustmen, also seemed to insinuate how hospital staff, they had no reason to complain about the pressures caused by the pandemic and should seek other employment if they didn't like what was happening. And the landlord of that function, the former mayor, who it's recently been revealed had a European arrest warrant out against him for 12 offences and has now been charged with rape. Not quite the all-encompassing morality needed to produce the perfect record claimed by the council's complaints figures now, is it? Now, as an example, I'm going to refer to a case that didn't just raise concerns over 1 or 2 offences, but arguably exposed prominent local politician Steve Tierney as being a serial offender. Now, although I covered this complaint in detail in part 2 of my first reports made several months ago, in my next one I intend to cover how such evidence as Tierney calling members of the public scumbags was dismissed. Why unelected officers dismissed evidence already judged by an elected committee member as a form of bullying, a clear breach of the council's code of conduct. And why they refused to explain all of Tierney's offensive online allegations, some proven to be false. And that's before we even get started with his rebuttal. Remember when the Deputy Prime Minister was sacked by Theresa May for making a couple of misleading statements in his defence document? Well, 1 or 2 misleading statements is not quite Tierney's style. No, it seems he decided to fill a 41-page defence document with a level of fiction and pathological dishonesty only small children would believe, literally. First, we have him excusing himself of his many online allegations, not by supplying evidence to validate them, as is customary in such matters, but by denying he ever made any, instead claiming the evidence was full of his opinions. Now that's a distinction the average 13-year-old student can make, though it would appear not the council's lawyer and 2 so-called independent officers. And when accepting what he calls strong terms, he insists how he never named people, instead referring to them as local haters and usual suspects. Strange then how these officers didn't notice the complaint was full of evidence to the contrary. Or how about here, where he declares he couldn't see any evidence anywhere of him accusing members of the public of lying, so decided for himself he can simply ignore that issue. Do I really have to say it? Oh, why were these people accused of lying? For simply trying to expose years of online abuse, seemingly designed to bully, offend, discredit, incite ill feeling and demonise anybody who's dared challenge him. Basically, all the offences he's now trying to lie his way out of. It seems quite clear, if Tierney was caught with his fingers in the till, he would deny they were his fingers and he would deny it was a till. Anyway, to cut a long story short, it can be proven how all of Tierney's main conclusions found on the final page of his defence document were based on pure and utter fiction. All of them. As we've already been reminded, an offence so serious in nature to get the Deputy Prime Minister sacked. Consequently, the monitoring officer received a second complaint. So, in the next report, we also look in detail at why, seemingly against her legal duty, she refused to process it. And when later we complained about this, how her deputy insisted the monitoring officer never said the second complaint couldn't be entered. And yet here's the monitoring officer telling the complainant how the process didn't allow for it to be entered. And here she is now claiming it couldn't be entered due to it being too similar to the first complaint. Then, as we all like a nice twist to a story, when entered several months later, here's the Deputy Monitoring Officer herself refusing the same complaint. Even used the same disingenuous excuse. Either that, or it requires us all to believe two highly paid council lawyers were unable to differentiate between offensive online behaviour and repeatedly and deliberately lying to pervert the outcome of a complaint. Two completely different offences. Coincidence? Possibly not. And for yet another twist in the tale, here's a complaint made since, this time against an opposition councillor entered by one of Tierney's mates from the pub. Strange then how the Deputy Monitoring Officer now seems to find second complaints are acceptable after all, especially if they're similar. And back to the first. Well, basically, it appears officers rejected a complaint full of demonstrable evidence in favour of a defence document filled with barefaced lies a child could identify. Starting to understand how 174 complaints were entered and 174 complaints were dismissed? Now, in my next report, we will also be looking in more detail at how several complaints were made to the CEO in regards to what you've just seen, with requests for a fully independent investigation, all of which he refused. First, he seemed to feel the best approach to secure an objective outcome would be to ask his monitoring officer to administrate complaints surrounding her own behaviour. Not hard to figure out how that worked out then. Then he assigned an officer seemingly incapable of opening attachments, hence why her conclusions were in direct conflict with the black and white evidence supplied. Next, he gave it to the Deputy Monitoring Officer, who we've just seen, and who had already been involved in dismissing two of the previous complaints. So for her to now rule in our favour would mean finding herself guilty of extreme negligence or corruption. So no conflict of interest there then. So round and round we went, with two defining aspects. One, officers repeatedly refusing to explain evidence a child could understand. Two, officers disingenuously hiding behind legislation that allows no right of appeal, more of which in a moment. Finally, I confronted the CEO and Deputy Monitoring Officer to confirm whether such legislation negates their legal obligation to investigate evidence of corruption or ensure their senior officers behave honestly and objectively. And in response, very conveniently for them, I seem to have exhausted the council's processes and I will now be ignored. In other words, basically, shut up and go away. And this, ladies and gentlemen, I assure you, is the only reason why my campaign to stop the abuse of almost £1 million of funding took several years. Because senior council officers repeatedly ignored and dismissed black and white evidence of wrongdoing, which would still be continuing today at your expense. Anyway, as stated, the details of all this will be covered in future reports. But for now, let's stick with and concentrate on how this is allowed to actually happen. Now, when such childish and irresponsible behaviour, like Tierney's, is rewarded with impunity, it breeds contempt and becomes dangerous in many ways. After viewing CCTV footage allegedly showing 3 councillors breaching COVID laws, the council's senior environmental health officer felt most right-minded people would be very concerned and many outraged that 3 senior councillors could have such little regard for the public health. However, apparently when he tried to bring an internal hearing against them, it seems he was told if he did make a complaint, it would go nowhere and he would be taken off the licensing case. Now, being the whistleblower for the story, his wife went on to point out how the frustrations of being gagged has had a significant effect on his mental health. So, It appears it's not just the public being gagged here, but the council's own officers, which, along with a 33-year unblemished career, we've now lost. But it has to be asked, is it here we also find the truth? You see, it was claimed how senior managers were afraid of the repercussions of such a complaint, and it seems are intimidated by these councillors. Now, I've spent some of my past in the company of truly exceptional people, testified by their individual achievements. And I'm sorry, but these councillors are far, far from that. Most have very little personal success whatsoever, and many elected on blind party voting or remain in uncontested seats, subjects I also intend to cover in coming reports. So although of themselves, in no stretch of the imagination are these individuals intimidating, they can get to hide behind and yield immense power of a council. However, to answer the question, so what went wrong, we have to look back to the introduction of the 2011 Localism Act. You see, previous to this, complaints were dealt with by an independent body, which had real power and had no personal relationship with the defendant. However, in 2011, the government took away the power and allowed councils to deal with complaints in-house. Basically, we now have powerless senior officers holding senior councillors to account. And under this system, who holds senior officers to account? That's right, senior councillors. Now, I'm not making excuses for them, but it's like asking officers to confront somebody holding a loaded shotgun when armed only with a water pistol. How can this do anything other than breed corruption? Surely both parties' interests will be served best by maintaining the political status quo. And if true, especially in areas influenced by a dominating party like mine, senior officers will surely be encouraged to simply protect their own highly paid positions by covering up corrupt behaviour of the ruling councillors, even if it comes at the expense of our local democracy. Now, in addition to all this, emboldened by 2 more evidence complaints being dismissed, Tierney elevated his lies to the local press, where he attempted to mislead the electorate into believing all 3 evidence complaints were trumped-up nonsense and designed to damage his reputation. But the point to be made becomes apparent when you notice Tierney mentioning how he welcomes the recent changes to the rules, which he thinks are better. And why does he think they're better? Simple, really. He wrote them. That's right. The system is so broken, it will actually allow an alleged serial offender like Tierney to lower the standards to encompass his own immoral behaviour. Surely that's like letting a thief write the laws to fraud. But now, for the final nail in the coffin of justice, the 2011 Localism Act took away any right to appeal these decisions. Even a High Court judge's decisions can be appealed, but not these officers. And what then of Boris, when his mate was in trouble and he assured us all how...
The issue in this case is whether a member of this House had a fair opportunity to make representations in this case, or whether as a matter of natural justice, our procedures in this House allow for proper appeal.
So what about our right of appeal then? Or once again, is it one rule for them, while us plebs remain undeserving of this so-called natural justice? And what then of Tierney's new lies and false allegations? Surely people have the right to use the council's complaint system without being publicly bullied and demonised, especially by an elected politician covering up his own guilt through fraudulent claims they invented their concerns. So was a complaint entered to the Fenland District Council? No, of course not. What's the point? And that is the point. What Freedom of Information Request 7574 actually appears to expose is the system of local accountability is so shamelessly open to abuse to make it non-existent. Now, many find it worrying how so familiarised we are becoming to politicians' lies that we now almost find them acceptable. However, the day flagrant corruption becomes acceptable is, for me at least, the day democracy dies. But just to be clear, this is not really about corruption in and of itself. No, what it's about is the in-your-face aspect of it all. The fact that senior officers will happily send out into the world evidence of their offences and or failings. This surely exposes not only a contempt towards their legal responsibilities, but also towards the public and their individual concerns. A level of contempt arguably only matched by any notion of individual accountability. Basically, under the current system, they will never be held to account, and more importantly, they know it. That's what this is about. And disturbingly, number 10 intends to give local councils even more power. Yes, maybe the Localism Act geographically brings the power closer to the people, but in the real world, it appears officials can simply slam that door in our face. So, what can we do, right? And yes, I get it. I get how for many it's easier to simply say, nothing I can do, or it won't make any difference. But if that was true, many flagrant injustices would still be alive and well today. So what can we do about it? Simple. Just take a minute out of our day and use the link below to sign a government petition. Let's at least try and stop what most right-minded people know to be wrong. The main premise of the petition is to stop councils investigating themselves with impunity and give us back our right of appeal, our right to natural justice. But not by some government arranged independent process. We've just seen how their idea of appointing independent officers panned out. No, stop allowing council officers and local politicians to write their own rule books and mark their own homework. Let the people do it. After all, you employ them, you pay their wages, you should ultimately hold them to account. And not through the pretense of local elections where most people don't even show and the unsuitable individuals get elected through blind party voting or retain uncontested seats. No, let the conduct rule book be written and appeals handled through what is called sortition. This is where randomly picked members of the public get to decide, in what is more commonly known as Citizens Assemblies. These are becoming increasingly popular, one already undertaken in Greater Cambridge. They give a wholly objective outcome, are almost impossible to corrupt, and even the UK government is becoming supportive of them. Please see the link below for more details. Running a 6-year campaign to expose the Cambridgeshire community transport scandal also exposed how meaningful direct accountability is what is missing out of local government, and the lack of it clearly allows for systemic corruption. So let's sign the petition and at least try to place the power back in the hands of the people. After all, I believe for them to deny such a simple guarantee to transparent objectivity would be a flagrant declaration to us all as to their commitment to keep the status quo, keep the corruption and keep the public gagged. Anyway, that's it for this report. Thank you for listening, and please join me next time when we go through what I feel can reasonably assessed as the cover-up of the cover-up of the cover-up of the cover-up of the cover-up. So please subscribe and hit the notification button to be alerted when it's available. A like would be appreciated, and if you feel this form of accountability is important, please hit the share button. And possibly you may even consider helping with the production and promotion costs by making a contribution through the Patreon link below. Large or small, any donation will be gratefully received. So until the next time, stay safe, take care, but most of all, try not to let the buggers get you down. Bye bye.